Hello, my name is Sean Furlong, and when determining what to do research on, I knew I wanted to do a topic that interested me. And one thing I found interesting was the number of Internet of Things devices I had in my home and realizing I knew nothing about them. So I thought it would be interesting to do research to determine how data is collected within these Internet of Things devices. And within those data collection practices, are there any potential security or ethics vulnerabilities that could potentially lead to further exposure by a malicious third party? So just a little introduction of what we're going to go through. I'm going to just give you a framework of how I came about my research and what this research is going to be about. Next, I'm going to provide an overview of the results of the research, give a little discussion and an ultimate conclusion on that research. Then we're going to talk about what went well with that research. And then we're also going to talk about potential improvements and lessons learned. So when discussing a topic, I knew I wanted to do a topic that was going to be interesting to me. So I looked at my Internet of Things devices. So defining an Internet of Things device, it's basically a device that's connected to a network. It could be Wi-Fi, it could be cellular network that collects data on a user in order to perform a specific function or service. So that could be a home assistant, that could be a smart doorbell, smart watch, it could be a smart appliance. These devices collect a lot of types of data, and part of this research was going to determine as a user if I could figure out what data was being collected on me and ultimately an average American consumer. Because I realized with the Internet of Things, I had more questions than I realized, like what data was being collected, how are they storing that data, are they being transparent with privacy, do they share that data with other people, and also are there actual security measures that I can look up and determine that this is what is being done to protect my data. Ultimately, I wanted to see transparency and security from these companies. And by the end of it, I would get an overall sense of the state of data and how data is collected within the Internet of Things, and if that potentially needed to be changed. So when looking at my results, what I decided to do for my research was I chose 5 companies that had 5 different Internet of Things devices. They were different sizes and companies and provided different services, but they were all publicly disclosed pieces of information that I could find very easily. I made sure of that. From my research, I found 90 types of data from all 5 devices, which are all listed here. So the Amazon Alexa, the Google Home, Smart Nest thermostat, Ring doorbell, and smart appliances from Samsung, such as refrigerators. So with those 90 pieces of data, that included everything from personal data, financial data, behavior of searches and people you communicated with, location data, such as IP addresses, even cell towers in your immediate area or your Wi-Fi information. I realized larger companies disclosed more information. Google and Samsung basically told you that they took everything from you. In terms of privacy policies, I saw that most companies had strong internal privacy policies, meaning that they took your data and basically had good, strong safeguards in place to protect your data within the company. Where things started to get a little shaky was when it came to third-party data sharing. Third-party means like an app or a service that takes the data that might be on those devices and uses them for their personal use or service for the user. what I realized there was that there was either disclosure beyond the scope of what I felt like the service was providing, or they chose to just pass off responsibility of sharing that data that was collected to that company. So basically, once it passed hands, it was no longer their responsibility if something were to happen to it. And surprisingly, I saw no specific security demonstrations, with the exception of one company, the Ring doorbell, that demonstrated that it uses end-to-end encryption on their video files and ultimately made the user controller of the data that was being stored by Ring itself. But everyone else just provided a simple sentence saying that safety was important, didn't provide any specific examples. So what the results demonstrated was that their data policies of companies have an internal focus. They're more focused on making sure that they have safeguards in place to prove to customers that they can be trusted. I noticed that policies were extremely varied. No one policy looked the same, and they contained different pieces of information, also discussed different points. Vulnerabilities can potentially exist, as I mentioned, with third parties. If you're sharing data, and you pass off responsibility to that company, then there's the potential that the data that was originally collected by that company could fall into the wrong hands or be used for the wrong purposes. Companies basically showed what they wanted. They wanted to try to gain trust from the user by offering transparency. But I do think that a uniform standard would be more beneficial to the user in the long run, and probably be better for companies in terms of trust in the long run if there was like a legislative guideline that would say what needed to be said in a data or privacy policy. The conclusions, I was able to determine that I felt like vulnerabilities existed, mainly with data sharing and security measures. These policies do not disclose the same information, and I think that leaves the user more confused and asking more questions. These companies were quick to dismiss the responsibility once the data switched hands to another company, and basically was able to conclude that further legislation was necessary. So with this research, I think to myself, what went well? So it was the first time I did research on this scale, and I think basically putting something together in 15 weeks, I was really happy with the final product I was able to produce. I felt like I was able to create a consistent framework for analysis. I felt like I was able to take each company and look at it in the same way, and I was able to provide a good analysis of qualitative data. I had fun reading through all these data policies. I never thought that I would be that nerdy guy who's just reading through all the terms and agreements, but I did that for the sake of research, and I was really surprised with what I found. I thought that it was an extremely interesting process, and I got to learn about the current state of the Internet of Things. I learned from the literature that basically people are in agreement that legislation is needed, and legislation is not keeping up with the overall expansion of data collection. There was room for improvement. Managing the scope was a big thing for me. I found myself starting with this huge scope and constantly having to refine it and refine it and refine it. I think if I were to go back, I would also refine variables about data policies I was looking at, maybe sizes of companies or like specific products, seeing similarities between home assistance devices or smartwatches or smart appliances, and then also trying to find a better implementation of quantitative data in this analysis, I think would have added another layer of depth. So there was some important lessons that were learned. Time management was very essential to this assignment, to this research. I learned that 15 weeks is longest time in the world, but it's also the shortest amount of time in the world. So it's important to prioritize what needs to get done, looking at big tasks and understanding and coming to the consensus that this is what needs to be done now, but this can fit into a context later, and just learning to rack and stack important things that needed to be considered. Staying consistent with deadlines. This was really big for me. I found that with scope, sometimes I got distracted within one section of my research, and at times found myself getting stuck and bottlenecked at that portion of that research. So keeping myself consistent with deadlines made sure that I pushed through to the next thing that needed to be done. And also working on tasks, but thinking about past things that I've done and how what I'm working on now could improve the introduction or the literature review. How do I refine my methodology? Bringing all the pieces together to essentially create the final product of that is ultimately my thesis research. Following procedure, that's another important one. I think the lesson I learned was once I built a consistent framework, I found a unified way that I was going to assess data from any company, no matter what the function of the IoT device was. That allowed me to look at each giant data policy that was different from each other in a more unified and motivated, objective approach. Managing scope, that had been discussed. That was my big issue that I had, and probably I overcame it, but it was something that was really a lesson I needed to learn. Making decisions based on the criteria I have, making quick decisions, making effective decisions, making decisions that were ultimately beneficial for my research. I think that was extremely important. And remaining objective and unbiased. So including data, even if it didn't necessarily fit with the rest of my data, that was really important to me. So I got all the facts in my results. I tried to remain as unbiased as possible with my results, and I made my inferences based on the results in the discussion section and the conclusion section. What I learned about myself. So I really enjoy research. That's one thing I've learned. And it's much easier to do research on something when you're interested about it. So that was important with topic selection, was ensuring that I found a topic that I found personally interesting. Simple is sometimes better. I found myself with a million thoughts at the beginning of this research, and I was able to refine it down to simpler, more distinct paths to research, and that ultimately led to a much more cohesive product. And scheduling is the key to success, making sure I have stuff to do every week and I get that stuff done. That was what was really important for me to produce the ultimate final product. So in conclusion, what I learned is that the Internet of Technology is the future, data is expanding, but data management is important, key to maintaining the expansion of that infrastructure. Trust is another foundation. Users aren't going to want to use products if they do not trust the companies. Transparency is very important and completely needed by the companies, which is why I conclude that potentially maybe future legislation is necessary. And also take the time to think about the Internet of Things devices in your home. How many do you have? And how much data do you think those companies are ultimately collecting on you? So that was my research. I'm happy anyone who's listening to this got some insight that I got. I had a lot of fun with this, and I want to thank everyone for their time.